Hello everyone, SJ Newell here. Today we begin a series of videos in which we will be analyzing claims made by Alan Parr in a recent YouTube publication entitled 5 Bible Verses Many Charismatics, Word of Faith, and Pentecostals Take Out of Context! Exclamation point. Once again, I'm going to preface this critique by saying I believe Alan is a man of God and I'm thankful for the work that he's doing. This analysis is not meant as any kind of attack on him, and I encourage everyone to check out more of his content. Now, Mr. Parr does not clarify in this video what exactly he means by the accusation of taking a verse out of its context. And as you'll see in our video that I'm linking to below, there are basically two very different meanings to these kinds of expressions. Without Alan's clarification, we won't be able to test the claims about context that he makes, but that's okay because we can still follow our usual format by making observations and identifying assumptions. Roll it.
The first one is Romans chapter 4, verse 17. And I want to get this one out of the way early, just in case you don't watch the rest of this video. Now, this verse says, "As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations in the presence of him whom he believed, God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did." Now I want you to pay attention to this last phrase, "and calls those things which do not exist as though they did." So you have a lot of charismatics and Pentecostals who will just take that one snippet of a verse and build an entire false theology around this idea that you and I have the creative power, just as God did, to speak words, and if we speak these words, things will come into existence. Oh, my friend, look.
The more of these discussions I get into, I'm beginning to see a few common themes that almost always come up. One of these is how the position you're opposing gets worded. Word it one way, and it can easily be dismissed or shown to be wrong. Word it another, and it can become a reasonable and even formidable point of view. Now, I can't exactly blame people for doing what I feel is a subpar job of stating these ideas, because truth be told, many of the proponents of these positions don't do the greatest job articulating them either. So, in a lot of respects, Mr. Parr is just repeating what he's heard from the horse's mouth, and I can understand that. But if it were me teaching on this topic, I would probably start by referencing the numerous passages in Proverbs about the power of the tongue and words. Then go to the Gospels, particularly Mark 11:23, where Jesus had just finished speaking to a tree, and then told his disciples that whosoever speaks to a mountain and doesn't doubt will have whatever they say. Then I'd point to the fact that a large percentage of the miraculous deeds Jesus performed, he performed by using words. He spoke to the wind and the waves, and they obeyed him. He spoke to sickness and disease, and they obeyed him. He spoke to a fig tree. He spoke to the dead. He spoke to the devil. In almost every area of Christ's ministry, he spoke, and what he said came to pass. But yeah, that was Jesus, you might say. But Jesus then went on to say this, "I tell you the solemn truth. The person who believes in me will perform the miraculous deeds that I am doing, and will perform greater deeds than these, because I'm going to the Father." And then maybe after all of this, I would reference this passage here in Romans 4 and point out that God had changed Abram's name to Abraham, so that between the time that God had changed his name and the time that the promise was manifested, Abraham would be calling and introducing himself as father of a multitude, something that he wasn't. Or you could say something that did not exist. Rod Saunders over at Jew and Greek actually did an entire video on this subject. He does a good job of deflating a lot of the hysteria and adding some context to this idea. So if you want to know more about this angle, I'll link to it below. So when Mr. Parr says people are building an entire false theology around this little snippet of scripture, I guess I'd need to see an example of what he's talking about from an actual minister who does this. But what he may be seeing is Bible teachers using the terminology as a quick reference to the scriptures I just gave you. In other words, they could just be using this terminology as lingo or idioms. We all do this. When people say something like, God is sovereign, well, there's an ocean of ideology behind that, and just because someone doesn't take the time to break it all down, doesn't mean they're building theology around just that one quote. You also see these kinds of expressions change and become mingled with Scripture. Like people will say, God decrees the end from the beginning, or to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Even though the Bible doesn't really say either of those, these are Scripture quotes and terms that over time begin to fuse together, but the audience typically understands what's in view, even if it's kind of messy. Like I said, without a real-world example of the use of this term, and a chance to sit down and dialogue with the person or persons who used it, we're not going to be able to verify Mr. Parr's claim that people are building an entire false theology around the reference.
Our friend, let's look at the context of Romans chapter 4. First and foremost, Romans chapter 4 is a chapter that is talking about the process and the way of salvation. And it is a chapter that is about one man, a man named Abraham. And basically, God is trying to teach the Roman church how to become saved, which is always through faith. And he basically goes back to Abraham's example and says, hey, just in case you think faith is a New Testament thing, the way of salvation has always been believing in God and exercising faith in God. So he uses Abraham as a prototype and says, hey, even Abraham, when he believed in God, it was credited to him as righteousness. What did Abraham have to believe? He had to believe that God was able to give life to a dead situation. This was a man who was 100 years old, and his wife was close to 90 years old, and her womb was dead. Their ability to give children was dead. She was barren, and that was a dead situation. And yet God was the one who called a dead situation and caused life to come out of it, giving them Isaac as a child. So this verse is not about you and I speaking things into existence. That's not the context for it. And furthermore, who is the one in this verse that is even doing the calling and the speaking anyway? It is God who is able to call things into existence and call something that is not as if it were.
Like I just mentioned, God had changed Abram's name to Abraham. So unless someone is arguing that Abraham never told anyone his name after that, then arguably it isn't just God that was calling things which do not exist as though they were. It was Abraham calling himself a father of multitudes.
Nothing in this verse says that we have the ability to speak anything into existence.
He is correct that this particular phrase is never used in reference to believers speaking, but like we mentioned prior from Proverbs, Mark 11, or John 14, there are other ways to demonstrate the same kind of idea. Romans 4:17 might come in as further support because it's an example of someone who believed and changed what they said to line up with what God said about them. And as a result, what was said came into existence.
Hopefully I got that across, because so many Christians, so many of you watching this, you're throwing that phrase around, oh, I speak this into existence. Don't speak it into existence. That is not biblical, and that's not what the scriptures teach.
Well, okay. He's ending here with a conclusion that is slightly different from his original premise. He started out with a stated objective to address scripture that is taken out of context.
In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 very common verses that many charismatic and Pentecostal preachers are taking out of context and leading so many people astray.
But ended with a conclusion about an entire ideology being false.
That is not biblical, and that's not what the scriptures teach.
Those are two different things. Scripture can be taken out of context to be used in support for an idea that is actually true. So even if he were able to demonstrate Romans 4:17 was taken out of context, which, as we already demonstrated, may or may not be the case depending on how it's being used and how you define the terms, the conclusion that calling things into existence is therefore false doesn't necessarily follow. Now, I'm not trying to be overly technical or confuse anyone, but we just got to be careful that a claim isn't being tacked onto the end here without being checked up on. Okay, my friends, we will pause it here, but do not fret. Part 2 will be coming out shortly. Thanks for watching.